The energy in the studio was light and joyful. The audience was excited, expecting to hear funny stories, jokes, and maybe even some behind-the-scenes moments from Hollywood. Steve Harvey was ready, smiling as he walked onto the stage, prepared to guide the conversation with his usual charm. Tonight's guest was someone special, Keanu Reeves. People loved him not just because he was a great actor but because he had a kind heart. When Steve introduced him, he didn't just call him a movie star. He said, "The media calls him the nicest guy in Hollywood. The internet says he's the last good man left. But me? I say he's the realest example of grace I've ever seen." The crowd cheered loudly as Keanu walked onto the stage. He wasn't flashy, no expensive jewelry, no designer logos. Just a simple black shirt, dark jeans, and a plain blazer. He gave a small wave, a soft smile, and nodded slightly, looking a bit shy about all the attention. As he sat down, something shifted. The air in the room felt different, more serious, almost sacred. The usual fun, light-hearted energy of the show seemed to slow down, like something deeper was about to happen. At first, the conversation was what everyone expected. Steve asked about Keanu's movies, his life in Hollywood, and the roles that made him famous. But soon things changed. They started talking about something more meaningful. Steve brought up Keanu's reputation, how people always said he was kind and generous. Videos of Keanu giving up his subway seat for strangers, helping crew members on movie sets, and donating large amounts of money to people who worked behind the scenes, from stuntmen to makeup artists. All true, Keanu confirmed, but he didn't think of them as big, special actions. "To me, it's just the right thing to do." The way he spoke, calm, soft, without any ego, made the audience listen closely. He wasn't trying to be dramatic or impress anyone. He was just telling the truth. "Everybody's going through something," Keanu said. "Sometimes the smallest gesture can change someone's whole day." Steve nodded, clearly touched by those words. There was something powerful about hearing this from Keanu, someone who had every reason to become cold or distant. Instead, he had chosen kindness. Then the conversation took a deeper turn. Steve asked how Keanu managed to stay so humble, even after all his success. Keanu took a slow, thoughtful breath. "I guess I've always felt that none of this is promised," he said. "I've lost a lot. And when you lose people you love, when life shakes you to your core, you realize that fame, money, none of it makes you better than anyone else." For a moment, Keanu's eyes drifted, like he was remembering something painful. "I moved around a lot as a kid," he continued. "I was born in Lebanon, raised in Canada. My father left when I was young. My sister battled leukemia. I lost my partner. I lost a child. And still, I'm here. Every day is a choice. You either let pain harden you or you let it shape you into someone softer." The audience was completely silent. You could feel the weight of his words in the air. People were holding their breath, reflecting on their own pain, their own struggles. Steve didn't speak right away. Instead, he quietly touched the small crucifix hanging around his neck. He didn't say anything at first, just let his fingers rest there, as if he was silently acknowledging something deep inside himself. Then after a long pause, he finally spoke. "You talk about silence like it's familiar," he said, his voice softer now. Keanu nodded. "It is. Silence has been my companion for a long time. But in that silence, sometimes, I hear the clearest things." Steve leaned back slightly, his eyes thoughtful. "Have you ever heard God in that silence?" For the first time in the conversation, Keanu paused. A long, real pause. Then he looked at Steve straight into his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I believe in something greater. I've questioned it, I've walked away from it, I felt alone. But even in the deepest darkness, I could feel something. A presence. A peace. Not always loud, not always comforting, but always there." Steve's fingers tightened around his cross. He nodded slowly. "That's faith," he whispered. "Even if it doesn't have a name. Even if it's just something you feel." Keanu looked down at Steve's cross now. His expression changed. He hesitated, almost as if he was about to step off a ledge. He leaned forward slightly. "Steve," he said, his voice lower now, full of something different, something deeper. "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud before?" Steve didn't speak. He just nodded. Keanu took a deep, slow breath. "There was a night," he began. "A few years ago. I was in a really dark place. I couldn't move. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I wasn't even sure I wanted to be alive. Everything felt empty. The entire studio was silent. I was scrolling through my phone," he continued, "just trying to distract myself, trying to feel something. And then, I came across a video." Keanu looked directly at Steve now. It was you, Steve, talking about faith, about purpose, about how God doesn't waste pain. Steve's face froze. His hand gripped the cross tighter. But it wasn't just what you said, Keanu added. It was how you said it. Like you had lived it. And you were wearing this crucifix. This exact one. And I remember thinking, this man believes in something bigger. Maybe I can too. Steve slowly looked down at the cross on his chest, his fingers closing around it. I watched that clip 3 times, Keanu whispered. And the next morning, for the first time in weeks, I got out of bed. He sat back slowly as if the memory itself was heavy to carry. I've never told anyone that, he said, but I've carried your words with me ever since. Steve didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice cracked. I was just talking from the heart, he said. I had no idea. Keanu interrupted him gently. That's just it, Steve. You didn't have to know. That's what made it real. You weren't trying to inspire me. You were just being yourself. And that. Keanu paused, his voice filled with gratitude. That saved me. Steve looked down, his eyes filled with emotion. The audience watched, some with tears in their eyes. This wasn't just another Hollywood interview. It was something bigger. It was proof that even the smallest words, spoken from the heart, could change someone's life. There were tears in Steve's eyes now. The bright lights in the studio made one tear shine as it rolled down his cheek. And that cross you wear, Keanu said, his voice full of respect. It's not just a piece of jewelry. It's a sign. A message. You think you're just a funny guy who believes in God. But Steve, I think you're something more. Steve looked confused but was listening. I think you're a hidden preacher, Keanu said. And I have something to tell you. Something that might change your life the way you changed mine. The whole studio was silent. Even the cameras felt like they stopped moving. Steve held onto the cross around his neck and whispered one word. I'm listening. The silence wasn't the kind that happens on TV for drama. It wasn't a break between jokes. It was something deeper, like everyone in the room could feel something important was about to happen. Keanu leaned in close to Steve. His eyes were kind, his voice soft but serious. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone before? Steve was surprised but nodded, giving him space to speak. Keanu sat back in his chair, adjusting like he was getting ready to open a door that had been closed for a long time. Everyone in the audience was completely still. No one whispered. No one moved. They were all paying full attention. Keanu took a deep breath. His eyes stayed on Steve, but it looked like he was remembering something far away. There was a time in my life, he said, when I didn't want to wake up. Steve didn't say anything, but his whole body became still, like his heart was listening closely. I lost people, Keanu continued. Not just to death but to life, to time, to pain. One after another. His voice was calm, but his words felt heavy. My daughter was born but didn't live, Keanu said gently. And just a few weeks later I lost Jennifer. She was the closest thing I had to home. He paused and looked down at his hands for a moment. I don't think I cried right away. Sometimes sadness isn't loud. Sometimes it's so quiet you forget you're even alive. The audience held their breath. Some leaned forward. Some wrapped their arms around themselves. I kept working, Keanu said. Keep doing interviews. Kept playing different characters. Because it was easier to pretend to be someone else than to be myself. When I myself hurt too much. Steve touched his cross again. Not as a show. Just because it helped him feel steady. But no matter how much noise was around me, Keanu said, I couldn't silence the emptiness inside. And one night, that emptiness almost won. Steve tilted his head, searching Keanu's face, waiting to hear what happened next. It was late, Keanu said. I was alone. I hadn't slept in days. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to be. He took a deep breath. So I just sat there. In the dark. For hours. A long pause. No prayers. No thoughts. Just nothing. The kind of nothing that feels like the end. Then Keanu's voice changed just a little. And that's when it happened, he said. Steve was listening closely. I picked up my phone. I wasn't looking for anything. Just scrolling, trying not to feel. Keanu took another slow breath. And I saw a video. Steve blinked, surprised. It was you, Keanu said. Steve looked shocked. You were on stage, Keanu continued, talking about hard times. About how God doesn't waste pain. About how the things that feel like they're breaking us might actually be making us stronger. Steve nodded slowly. He remembered saying those words. I don't know why I stopped scrolling, Keanu admitted, but I watched the whole thing. And then I watched it again. His voice cracked just a little. You said, if you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. Keanu swallowed hard. For some reason, that sentence felt different. Like someone finally saw me. Not as an actor. Not as a famous person. Just as a man sitting alone in the dark. Steve exhaled softly. His hand rested fully on the cross now. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was almost a whisper. And I need you to know, Steve, that night I stood up. He let the words sit there. Not because I was healed. Not because I suddenly had all the answers. But because, for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. The words hit Steve hard. He didn't try to hide it. His eyes filled with tears. His lips pressed together, trembling a little. Keanu looked at him with gratitude and deep respect. I never planned to tell this story, he said. But sitting here looking at you, I realized I had to. Steve's voice came out slowly, thick with emotion. Man, I don't even know what to say. Keanu shook his head. You don't have to say anything, he said. You already did years ago. He pointed at the cross around Steve's neck. That cross you wear, that's what caught my eye first. Before your words. Before your message. That was the first thing I noticed. And at that moment it was like a lighthouse. Steve looked down at his cross again. His hand tightened around it, holding it close. I kept watching your message for the next few days, Keanu said. Not because it fixed me, but because it reminded me, healing doesn't need all the answers. It just needs hope. The audience was still quiet. Some people wiped their eyes. Others just sat there, feeling the moment. Steve leaned back, trying to take it all in. You think you're just talking, Keanu said. Just being funny. Just getting through life. But that night, you did more than that. You lifted someone up when they didn't have the strength to stand. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, letting it sink in. I needed to tell you this, Keanu said, because the world knows you as a TV host, a comedian, a guy who motivates people. But I don't think that's the full truth. Steve looked back at him, still in shock. I think, Keanu said slowly, you're a minister in disguise. Silence filled the room again. Steve's eyes filled with tears. He shook his head softly, not to disagree, but because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. You ever wonder why people are drawn to you? Keanu asked. All the time, Steve admitted. Keanu smiled gently. It's because they're not just hearing your voice, he said. They're feeling your spirit. You carry something special, man. Steve let out a short, shaky laugh. I'm just trying to make it like everyone else. And that's what makes it real, Keanu said. You're not trying to be anything other than you. And because of that, you reach people you'll never even meet. Keanu turned to look at the audience. People in rooms like this. People watching from home. People sitting in silence, like I was that night. Then he turned back to Steve. And I know it's hard sometimes, Keanu said, carrying that kind of weight. Not knowing if what you do even matters. Steve nodded slowly. He felt those words. But I'm here to tell you, Keanu said, it does. Keanu's face changed. He looked more serious, more focused. He leaned in closer and spoke softly. Steve, the way you wear that cross, it's not just jewelry. It's a message. And tonight I have something important to tell you. Something that might change your life, just like you changed mine. Steve's eyes widened. The crowd got quiet. Everyone could feel something special was happening. What do you mean? Steve asked in a soft voice. Keanu didn't blink. I've kept these words inside me for a long time, he said. They came from you. And tonight, I need to say them back to you. Steve sat still, breathing a little heavier. Keanu nodded. Because I think you may have forgotten how powerful they are. The room felt heavy, like everyone was waiting for something big. Steve Harvey didn't move. He just stared at Keanu, who sat up straight, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I remember the video, Keanu said. The lighting wasn't great. The picture was a little blurry. But there you were, standing on stage. You had a microphone in one hand and your other hand rested on your chest, right over that cross. Steve nodded slowly. He could already feel the memories coming back. You were talking about purpose, Keanu continued, but not like a rehearsed speech. It was real. It was like you were fighting through your own pain while sharing your message. And then you said something that stayed with me forever. Keanu locked eyes with Steve. You said, pain has a language. When someone who has been through something speaks, it cuts through the noise. Steve's lips parted slightly. His hand went to his chest, touching the cross again. Keanu continued. Then you said something else, something I will never forget. God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Steve's eyes filled with emotion. You said that God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things, Keanu said. That even if you think you're just telling jokes, just paying bills, just trying to get through the day, God might be using that to change someone's life. Steve leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The memory is becoming clearer now. He remembered that video. He had made it years ago, late at night after a tough show. There was no script. He had just spoken from his heart. Keanu took a breath. That night when I saw that video, I realized something. It wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it. You believed it. And because you believed, it lit something inside of me. Keanu looked down for a moment, his voice softer now. I had lost my way, he admitted. I felt empty, lost in silence. I didn't know where to go next. But when I heard your words, when I saw how much you meant them, it reminded me that even in my darkest moments, I wasn't invisible. He looked back up at Steve. You were a stranger to me, he said. But in that moment, you became a light in the dark. Steve let out a deep breath. It was the kind of breath that carries a lot of emotion, a lot of years. Keanu smiled gently. That's the thing about lights, he said. They don't always know who they're shining for. They just shine. There was a long silence. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Just full. Full of words, full of emotions, full of things that didn't even need to be said. Then Steve spoke. His voice was quieter now. You know, sometimes I wonder if I've done enough, he admitted. All the comedy, all the hosting, all the speaking, if it really means anything. Keanu leaned in a little. It does, he said. I'm proof of that. Steve shook his head, overwhelmed. I was just trying to survive, man. I wasn't trying to save anyone. Keanu smiled. And that, he said, is exactly why you did. The audience stirred. Some people wiped their eyes. Others just sat quietly, feeling the moment. Steve looked out at the crowd, then back at Keanu. You said something changed in you when you saw that video, Steve said. What was it? Keanu thought for a moment. Then he answered. Hope, he said. I realized that maybe the silence wasn't the end of my story. Maybe, just maybe, God still had something for me to do. He looked at Steve again. And when I saw that cross on your chest while you spoke about purpose, it wasn't just a coincidence. It was a sign. A reminder that even in the darkest places, light finds a way in. Steve nodded slowly. His face showed how much this meant to him. You reminded me, Keanu continued, that I wasn't forgotten. That my story wasn't over. Keanu paused. Then he said, and I remember exactly what you said that day. I've carried those words with me for years. And tonight I need to say them back to you. Because maybe you've forgotten just how powerful they are. Steve looked at him, a question in his eyes. Keanu took a deep breath. His eyes were steady. Sometimes, he said, you're not the one being rescued. You're the one doing the rescuing. And you don't even know it. Steve's lips trembled slightly. You think you're just talking, Keanu said. But you're actually testifying. Keanu leaned back slightly, letting the moment sink in. Steve covered his face with his hands for a second. Then he looked up, his eyes shining with emotion. You remembered all that? He asked. I needed to, Keanu said simply. Because I wasn't just hearing you. I was being lifted by you. Steve sat back in his chair, his hands clasped together as if trying to hold himself together. The room felt different now. More than just a stage, more than just a show. It felt like something was healing under those bright lights. Keanu's voice came again, softer this time. And maybe you don't hear this enough, but Steve, you matter. Steve swallowed hard. Not for what you do, Keanu continued, but for who you are. You carried faith into places where people had none left, including me. Steve couldn't speak. He just sat there taking it all in. The studio was completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Keanu leaned forward again, his presence changing. It was like what he was about to say didn't just come from memory, it came from something bigger. Something sacred. I remember every single word of that message, he said. And I want to say them back to you now. Not just as a reminder, but as a mirror. Steve's eyes stayed on Keanu. Steve's eyes didn't move as he stared at Keanu. His body was still, but inside something was shifting. Keanu looked at him with calm, steady eyes, and then, with quiet respect, he began to speak. God doesn't always pick the strongest people or the ones who seem perfect, Keanu said. His voice was clear but gentle. Sometimes he chooses the ones who have been broken. The ones no one expects. Because they understand something that others don't. They know what it feels like to struggle, and that makes them able to reach people in pain in a way that the strong never could. Steve blinked slowly. The words felt like waves washing over him, too big, too powerful to fight. You don't need to stand behind a pulpit to share God's message, Keanu continued. You don't need to wear a robe to be called by him. You don't need a church to carry his word. His voice didn't shake. He wasn't just repeating something he had heard before. He wasn't acting. He was speaking something real, something true. Sometimes, Keanu said, your pain is your purpose. And sometimes, your jokes are just a way God uses to bring people hope. Steve's lips parted, but no words came out. He didn't know what to say. Keanu looked at him then, his expression filled with something deep. Something that wasn't just kindness but understanding. It was like someone offering a gift instead of a compliment. You thought you were just making people laugh, Keanu said. But you were doing more than that. You were touching hearts. You were saving lives. You were bringing light into dark places. Keanu let those words settle in the room. He didn't rush. He wanted Steve to feel them, to understand them. Then he said something that finally broke Steve's composure. You're a minister, Steve, Keanu said. You just wear a suit instead of a robe. Steve's head dropped. One hand went to his face, covering his eyes. The other hand gripped the small cross hanging around his neck. Tears slipped down his face, and this time he didn't try to hold them back. He didn't wipe them away. No one in the audience moved. There was no clapping, no cheering, just silence. A deep, sacred silence that filled the room like a presence. Then Keanu spoke again, but this time his voice was even softer, almost fragile. The way you hold that cross, Keanu said, his voice quiet but full of meaning, is not just jewelry, Steve. It's a sign. And tonight I think it's pointing to something bigger than both of us. Steve lifted his head slowly, his eyes still wet with tears. He didn't say anything, but his expression showed that he was listening. Keanu took a deep breath. It looked like he was preparing himself for what he was about to say next, as if the words had been waiting inside him for a long time. Because tonight I have something to tell you, Keanu said. Something that might change your life. Steve's face shifted, a mix of fear and wonder. His heart pounded. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew it was important. Keanu leaned in slightly, his voice steady but filled with something deeper than emotion. Like you changed mine. Steve slowly wiped his face, his hand trembling just a little as he lowered it. The tears hadn't completely stopped, but now there was something else in his eyes, understanding. Keanu nodded as if he was confirming something. This is real, he said. You saved my life. For a moment, the entire room felt frozen in time. Even the cameras seemed to bow their heads in respect. Steve let out a soft sound, a mix of a laugh and a sob. He shook his head slightly as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I was just trying to get through, Steve said. Just trying to survive like everybody else. Keanu nodded, his expression knowing. Exactly, he said. That's what made it special. The words lingered in the air, deep and heavy, like something unshakable. And then, something happened that no one expected. Steve stood up. His whole body shook, not from fear, not from weakness, but from something else. Something stronger than both. He didn't speak. He just touched the small cross on his chest again and looked at Keanu. Keanu stood too. Now they were face to face. The studio felt frozen. No one moved. Steve's voice came out in a whisper, but it carried something powerful with it. Why me? He asked. Keanu didn't look away. He had an answer, but he didn't rush to give it. He let the silence fill the space between them. I'll tell you, Keanu said. The audience didn't move. Some people in the crowd had tears rolling down their faces. Others were holding hands. No one reached for their phones. No one wanted to miss this moment. Steve let out a shaky breath. His voice cracked, but it was still steady. I've thought about quitting before, he admitted. Walking away from all of this. Keanu nodded like he already knew. I have too, he said. More than once. They both sat back down, not because the moment had ended, but because it had changed. Steve leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes stared off into the distance, lost in thought. I've asked God so many times, he said. What do you want from me? Sometimes I feel like I'm not good enough to talk about faith. Like I'm not clean enough. Like I don't always do the right thing. Keanu nodded again, his voice soft but certain. And that's exactly why he chose you. Steve blinked, taking in the words. Keanu continued, his voice calm but full of truth. God doesn't choose the ones who think they're perfect, he said. He chooses the ones who know they're not. Steve swallowed hard. The lump in his throat made it difficult to speak. Keanu kept going. He chooses the ones who have been overlooked, the ones who have cried behind closed doors, the ones who have felt broken. Steve's hands gripped together tightly. You're not the loudest, Keanu said. You're not the most polished. You didn't go to school to study the Bible. You didn't memorize scripture like a preacher. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of Keanu's words. But God saw your scars, Keanu said, and he still trusted you with a microphone. Steve opened his eyes. They were glistening not just with tears but with something deeper, something sacred. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a prayer, Steve whispered again, "But why me?" Keanu took a step forward. His eyes were steady. His answer was certain. "I'll tell you." The audience sat still. Some were silently crying. Some held on to the hands of the person next to them. But no one spoke. No one wanted to leave at this moment. Steve took a slow, deep breath, his voice raw but steady. "I've asked God that so many times," he admitted. "Why me? Out of everyone he could have picked, why would he pick me?" Keanu looked straight into his eyes. And then he answered, "I'll tell you." Steve looked up because Keanu's voice didn't sound like a preacher's. Keanu said, "Your voice sounds like someone who has been through hard times. Someone who knows what it's like to lose, to struggle, and to cry when no one is watching." There was no clapping, no music, just silence and the feeling that something important was happening. Steve looked at Keanu again, his eyes now full of deep thoughts. Then he asked, "Do you really believe we can still have faith in a world like this?" The question felt big, like it had been asked 1,000 times before by many people. Keanu didn't rush to answer. He just looked at Steve, calm and steady, as if he was thinking deeply before speaking. Then finally he said, "I believe faith is the only thing that isn't fake." Steve tilted his head, listening closely. "In Hollywood, we follow scripts," Keanu explained. "On camera, everything is planned. We pretend to be sad, we pretend to be happy. But faith," he paused. "Faith has no director. It has to be real. It asks you to trust even when it's hard." He leaned in, his voice softer but stronger. "Faith isn't shiny. It doesn't win trophies. It doesn't get invited to fancy parties. But faith saves people, quietly, deeply, forever." Steve nodded slowly. His heart felt full. "Hollywood teaches you how to act," Keanu continued, "but faith teaches you how to live." The audience didn't make a sound, but something in the room changed. It was like everyone could feel the truth in Keanu's words. "Faith is the only road," Keanu said, "where there are no cameras, no bright lights, no cheering. It's just you and God." Steve felt something powerful inside him. He placed his hand on his chest, trying to hold in his emotions. Keanu took a deep breath. "I didn't grow up with religion," he admitted, "but I know faith is real. Not because someone told me, but because it found me in the quiet. It found me when I was alone, when the world was dark." He looked at Steve with deep kindness. "And faith found me through you." Steve's eyes widened. He felt shaky, not from fear, but from something bigger than himself. Keanu continued, "Not the Hollywood version of you. The real you. The you who has been hurt but keeps going. The you who wears a cross and speaks hope into others, even when you're hurting too." Keanu stood up. After a moment, Steve stood too. They looked at each other, two men who had both felt pain, now connected by something bigger than pain. Then Keanu opened his arms. Steve didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and they hugged, not as actor and host, but as two people who understood each other. Slowly the audience stood up too. No one clapped. It didn't feel right to make noise. Finally, Steve turned to the crowd. His voice was shaky but full of feeling. "I've had a lot of special moments on this stage," he said, "but this was the greatest gift." He closed his eyes for a moment, then looked up. With deep honesty, he whispered, "Let's pray." And in that studio, in front of millions of people, two men who had been through pain became a light for others. And for a moment, the world believed again. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.